This is the best, they say, 100-day start of any president in history, and everyone is saying it. We've just gotten started. You haven't even seen anything yet. It's all just kicking in.
Donald Trump in Michigan selling his 100-day dream.
But has Trump 2.0 actually proved to be a little bit of a nightmare?
Now, just before we go through what is really quite an incredibly detailed look at what Trump has done in this most amazing 100 days, just a quick shout out to Venetia Rainey, our brilliant producer and senior planning editor who has done so much work for this episode of the podcast.
She's been very, very good indeed. Shall we start? Shall we kick off by listening to our reporter Cameron Henderson, who was at the Michigan rally last night and sent us this dispatch.
We will make America great again. I love you, Michigan. I love you. Have a good time. Thank you. God bless you all.
I'm in Macon County at a community college where Donald Trump has just finished his 100-day address. The MAGA faithful who've turned out to support their president are on their way home. Less of the hoopla of normal Trump rallies. There were a few warm-up acts, a prayer from the same man who gave a prayer to Trump upon his inauguration. But beyond that, it was fairly minimal until the president turned up bang on time. Again, a change from the rally. So there's a sense of increased professionalism, I suppose. Now, of course, when Trump took to the stage, things gradually, well, not gradually at all, things kicked up a gear. Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA was blaring over the speakers, and people on their chairs dancing, shouting, all the usual scenes.
God bless the
The president chose this place, Michigan, as this hub for American manufacturing, particularly auto workers. Of course, Detroit, the Steel City, was the home of US auto workers. I believe Trump described it as the city that puts the world behind the wheel. And he did that to focus on his message of jobs for American people, bringing together his 2 points about the economy and immigration that he hammered home during his election campaign, and 2 points that he can now brag about, particularly on immigration, as having achieved success since he's come into office. He used most of the speech to talk about numbers coming down in immigration and romped through the rest of his achievements, listing off the executive orders to rounds and rounds of applause from this worshipful crowd.
We have achieved the most secure border in American history by far. In American history. For 2 months in a row, we have now set all-time records, and this is by the media, the fake news media, which most of it is fake. We've set all-time records for the lowest number of illegal border crossings ever recorded. Think of that, ever recorded. The number of illegal border crossers released into the United States is down, listen to this please, 99.999%.
Now, there are a few blemishes to proceedings. Early on, at least one protester was removed from the room. Trump criticised him for looking like a girl, I believe, because he had a ponytail. And later, as Stephen Miller, Trump's, the architect behind Trump's immigration policy, took to the stage to give his sort of typical bombastic address.
Who's enjoying 100 golden days of America? President Trump has achieved the most secure border in American history. He's fighting violent crime. He's fighting the drug cartels. He's cutting your taxes. He's cutting wasteful spending. He's draining the swamp. He's standing up to the radical left. He's standing up to the communists, and he's making America stronger than it's ever been. President Trump will never stop fighting for you, your children, and your family, and President Trump will make sure that in this country, not illegal aliens, not criminals, not gangbangers, but American citizens come first, last, and always. Thank you. And thank you, President Trump, for being the greatest president in American history.
Several protesters were removed all at once, with a couple of them appearing to wrestle with the security guards who escorted them from the building. Now, typical of a Trump rally, you meet a whole range of characters who turn out to support the president through thick and thin. One man arrived in a suit with brick graphics behind it. As you can see, he's still standing here at the corner of your eye. He's travelled all the way from San Diego, driven over 3 days and thousands of miles to see the president in the flesh. He's been to more than 50 rallies. He said he stopped counting. And the thing he's most happy about so far is Trump's crackdown on the border. I spoke to other people in the front row Joes, who Trump called out during his rally. One of whom he called out for having lost weight, which I thought was a bit of a backhanded compliment. Saying that they're always there to support him. When I spoke to the front row Joes, they were telling me their favourite thing that Trump had done so far was on the economy, bringing jobs back.
What's interesting, Camilla, I think, is, of course, you know that Trump is not going to be saying, oh, yeah, I've done a few things wrong. It's all been a bit tough. I've made a few mistakes. I apologise to the world. Now, that's not going to happen. There has been a gentle decline in his overall approval ratings in the polls, which for many politicians might be a worry. But actually, when you look at the numbers, his current approval rating is 41.3%, which is falling. But actually, that was roughly where he was around the time of the election last November. And his polling has gone slightly up and slightly down. It is lower than average for any former president. But I think the key point around the polls is that people who like Trump know what he is, i.e. chaos, day to day, everything changes every few minutes almost via Truth Social or the latest post he's made. But they knew that was coming and they're still backing him.
Yes, maybe it's a case that we're being slightly warped because people over here who liked Trump before like him less, predominantly because of the Putin-Ukraine issue. But people in America aren't really feeling it like that or aren't seeing it like that. And let's be honest, Keir Starmer would give his eye teeth to be as popular now as he was on election day, so it's not a bad result. Should we go just through the sort of Trump tally of what he's done so far? So he's issued a record-breaking high of 124 executive orders during his first 100 days. By comparison, over their whole 4-year term, Biden signed 162, so only about 40 more. Trump, in his first presidency, signed 220. Obama signed 277. Bush signed 291. So we have got, on one hand, a record-breaking, seemingly, amount of executive orders signed in this shorter time, but then also a record-breaking low of just 5 new bills signed into law. So this is all about executive order over actual legislation.
It seems there is this logjam within Congress. They've been rowing over the budget. Trump is obviously already somewhat concerned about the midterms. That's the next elections for members of Congress. He might lose quite big and lose his majorities in both houses. And he is using executive orders much more aggressively for things like announcing that he wants America to pull out of the World Health Organization. And that means that although there has not been much activity on the legislative side, there has been a lot of activity genuinely in policy. And I think he's realised that's a much quicker way to get things done. Now, of course, in America itself, we've spoken regularly about the price of eggs. J.D. Vance famously saying, vote Trump, get cheaper eggs. They became very expensive for a while, but actually now have become a little cheaper, due largely to imports, so slightly against Trump's tariff policies. But the economy is vitally important to any president, the US economy. Certainly the tariffs has been one of the real cut-through policies that we have seen. And Trump hopes that by these new tariff barriers to all countries around the world, that will mean that companies will go back to manufacturing in America, this idea of America's golden age, which is what Donald Trump speaks about making America wealthy again. The problem he has there is that there's been no tangible effect yet on matters like inflation, the cost of eggs, but all the economic models suggest that if you have high tariff barriers, which are tariffs on your border, inflation comes to America. And also because of the sort of chaotic way that these tariffs have been on, off, also the business's ability to plan has been stymied, and that means that they are not investing, and that has increased the threat of recession.
So let's have a look at some of the figures. Growth was 0.8% in Q1 of this year, but that's down from 2.4% growth in the Q4 of 2024. I mean, that's all quite damaging, as is one economist, Torsten Slock, putting the possibility of recession at 90%. As you say, he's put all of his eggs in one basket, basically, hasn't he? I will make you richer. I very much was feeling that rhetoric when I was in Pittsburgh for that final rally before the election. Most of the people I spoke to, whether they were in hard hats or pinstripe suits, male, female, black, white, whatever, were all saying, I'm voting for him because he's going to make me keep more of my money. And if he can't do that, then he's in trouble. And then we talked about the approval rating, but actually the polling is looking slightly dicey. We've got a Reuters and Ipsos poll and a Fox News poll finding that just 37 to 38% of people approve of his handling of the economy. And then new Gallup polling out this week showing that a majority of Americans, for the first time since at least 2001, so that's a long, long time ago, believe their economic situation is worsening.
And as soon as consumer confidence drops, your propensity to buy drops, and that means activity drops, which leads to more threat of recession.
So we should say on the economy, mixed reviews.
Yes, there's obviously been an effect on voters' confidence, and it seems that some of the negative effects, particularly of his aggressive tariff policies and the day-to-day changes in those policies, are going to bring higher inflation and a higher risk of recession.
Now, if we move on to immigration, the Democrats won't agree with this analysis, but you could say that his policy has been successful so far, notwithstanding protest marches the length and breadth of the US about some of the deportations.
And one of the most important executive orders he signed was this almost militarization of particularly the southern border of America.
In fact, let's listen to him making those promises about securing the border back at the beginning of his presidency.
First, I will declare a national emergency at our southern border. All illegal entry will immediately be halted, and we will begin the process of returning millions and millions of criminal aliens back to the places from which they came.
So let's look at Mexico first of all, which is kind of the most obvious route for people to come into America. Famously, Trump building his wall and all the rest of it to cover a 2,000-mile border. I'm just reading that, not quite getting my head around the distance covered and the need to have troops on the ground. He's persuaded Mexico to send 10,000 officers to patrol that border. So that's pretty good, isn't it? And he shut down Joe Biden's CBP One app, which had helped almost 1 million migrants schedule appointments at US ports of entry for asylum processing. He's just shut that down. So what happens to them? And on top of that, we have had these mass deportations. Trump's border czar has claimed that they have actually deported so far 139,000 people since the inauguration on January the 20th. Bit of scepticism around that number, but let's do some basic maths. It might not hit 1 million, but it probably get to 750,000, Kamal, I would imagine.
And that's one thing that is polling very high for him in America, this success on controlling the borders. There's been a 95% drop in what are called encounters at the southern border with Mexico in March by Border Patrol agents, down to just 7,181, down from 137,473 in March 2024.
Wow.
Joe Biden had a
Yes.
very similar problem, frankly, as the Conservative government and the Labour government has here. What Trump has done, and this is why voters are really applauding it, is he has said he's going to cut immigration and he's going to increase security at the border, and he has done it. Let's listen to our US reporter, Susie Cohn, who has been to Panama to look at this amazing reverse in the trend of how immigration is operating across South of America.
I'm currently in Miramar. It's a small town of around 100 people on the coast of Colón in Panama. And before this year, this tiny little village of colourful houses, which is surrounded by tropical vegetation, and it's on the coast of the Caribbean Sea, had never been impacted by the millions of people who were travelling through Latin America to try and reach the US. But since Trump introduced his sort of hardline immigration policies, it's become a key stop-off as people make their way back down south. Most of the people here are from Venezuela, and that's where they're heading. They pay $260 for a boat ride to Colombia, which departs from here, and business is booming for the local community, which is taking in $6,000 a week. Some of those making the passage back down south say that Trump's policies left them no choice when he closed the border, and one became very tearful when he recalled his dream of how he planned to move to the US, own a car, a house, and find a wife. But now that dream has been shattered, and he's on his way back to Venezuela. While most of the migrants who pass through here barely stop and get straight on a boat that morning or the next day, those who can't afford it are stranded here as they figure out what to do next. I returned to the port in Miramar, Colón this morning, where before 7 a.m, just as the roosters were crowing, I watched 2 speedboats carrying 42 Venezuelan migrants, including 7 children, set off for the Panamanian coast towards Colombia. Those on board included Amber Ramirez and her 3 children, who had in October made the perilous journey to Mexico. They walked past dead bodies, avoided cartels, they were kidnapped at one point, and all of this was in search of the American dream. But after Trump was re-elected and sealed the US border, shutting down pathways for migrants to legally enter the country, their dream is over, and they are among the thousands heading back down south. Amber asked me, we did all of that for what, as she got on the boat, saying she was terrified of water. The Trump administration has also been piling pressure on migrants who are already in the US to self-deport, and one of those migrants was on the boat on Wednesday as well. Juan Miguel Perez, who had been living in the US for 2 years when he received a text telling him to leave or face a fine of $900 a day. I asked him what he thought when he received the message, and he said he feels disappointed to have to abandon the life he dreamed of, but he is looking forward to being reunited with his children in Venezuela.
So let's move on to, what should we call it? Bureaucracy, Doge, Elon Musk with a chainsaw. Let's cut back the federal bureaucracy. So lots of different areas here which he was trying to tackle in one go. He certainly demanded, particularly from law firms, particularly in universities, the closure of diversity, equity and inclusion programs. That really successful campaign slogan, Kamala Harris is for they, them, Donald Trump is for you, which was making the point that Kamala Harris had supported trans rights in prison.
So clever that. Somebody deserves a medal for that one,
which created a huge backlash amongst voters. That executive order that he announced again on day 1 or day 2, which was in America, there are only 2 genders, men and women. Very, very successful with voters. And DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. Musk pledged initially to cut at least $2 trillion from the federal government budget. Some people are claiming that he's going to hit many hundreds of billions in cuts, or the federal cuts will be many hundreds of billions. But I was at a breakfast with a very well-known and authoritative American economist, Ken Rogoff, and he said, if more than $100 billion has been saved overall from these programs, some of which have had to have been reversed because of legal challenges, he would be surprised.
Yeah, he's saying at the moment they've saved $160 billion. That's a claim. Quite hard to check it. Having said that, this has resulted in Amazon, Disney, Meta, Walmart, Google, Target, McDonald's all rolling back their DEI policies. And obviously these are some of the leading business names of America. You've had US aid shut down, which is hugely significant. I mean, we probably need another podcast, Kamal, to debate the wrongs and rights of that, but that saved a huge amount of money. We've got $2.3 billion of federal funding to Harvard having been frozen over anti-Semitism claims on campus. But what do the public think of Doge? I mean, I think it's probably being slightly overshadowed by rows about Elon Musk and whether he should be in the Oval Office at all and whether he's still friends with Trump and all the rest of it. Doge itself has a -12 approval rating. I mean, I've heard worse, but when you factor Musk into the equation, it falls to -18. That's a poll of polls done by the New York Times, which isn't particularly Trump or Musk friendly, you could argue.
No.
And let's be honest, I mean, who's the loser in all this? Musk's reputation, Musk's Tesla share price. I mean, one does wonder what he's getting out of all of this now, Kamal, by the way.
Fame and closeness to power, probably
Yes.
two of the biggest things.
So on bureaucracy, do we think he's getting a thumbs up or a thumbs down?
I think the battle with the universities, it's fine to say that they shouldn't just be politically partial towards the Democrats, which there's lots of evidence of. But the danger he has is that he is actually enforcing a new orthodoxy on them, which is a MAGA orthodoxy. It shouldn't be one for the other. It should be allowing them to have free expression. And there's been a lot of pressure on the legal firms in America to drop DEI schemes or anything that they are doing in that area in return for government contracts. And I think this makes quite a lot of people uncomfortable. I think it's the overall argument is the right argument around prejudice within higher university institutions. But is the method of Trump the right method? And is he simply replacing one set of sort of ideologies with his own set of ideologies?
And can we have a full audit of what exactly has been saved and from where, so that you can honour these claims of 160 billion or whatever it is that they claim to have shaved off the budget? Let's go on to foreign policy then, Kamal. I mean, let's actually have a recap of what Trump promised when he first took office. We had a promise that the war in Ukraine would be ended in a day. We had a promise that all of the Hamas hostages would be brought home. He was going to make Gaza great again and turn it into the next Dubai. He was going to get Europe to take care of its own security and stump up much more defence funding per GDP. And he was going to have a Iran nuclear deal signed.
So for the first three of those, end the Ukraine war in 24 hours. That hasn't happened. And there's massive controversy. This is not a peace deal between Ukraine and Russia. It is Ukraine surrendering its land to an invading force, and that has brought Trump a lot of criticism, some in America, but as you were saying earlier, people in America are, quite rightly focused on the economy and what's happening in their own country, not so much on abroad and particularly not on Europe. But in the UK, in Europe, and in many other countries, it's been very, very controversial and has brought a lot of criticism for Donald Trump. There are still hostages after the appalling events of October the 7th in Hamas's hands. And Gaza is still under daily bombardment and is still in the grip of a terrorist government. So that hasn't happened, cleaning up Gaza either. Europe taking care of its own security. There has been a big step up, particularly in Germany. We've had here in the UK, haven't we, that Starmer has finally got to the 2.5% of GDP after promising it for a long, long time. And there's a lot of positive noise about Trump re-engaging with Iran, and that Trump's approach to Iran, similar to 2016 to 2020, is actually putting that country and its autocratic rulers back in their box.
Also, it seems as if his relationship with President Zelensky has been sort of taken out of the deep freeze and thawed somewhat because of that historic meeting at the Vatican to mark the Pope's funeral. So that's a bit of progress, but again, we're waiting, aren't we, for the details of a peace deal. And we had Putin's proposed ceasefire rejected by the US president this week. According to Pew, which is a research centre in America, 56% of respondents expressed a lack of confidence in the president's foreign policy decisions. Half believe his administration has weakened the US internationally compared to the Biden administration, which is interesting, isn't it? Because there has also been this acceptance this week and a degree of admission, particularly from some of the White House's own top reporters, that they were asleep at the wheel, pardon the expression, on Sleepy Joe, that they didn't adequately report on him. You know, we were covering on the podcast when he was still US president that he was proving to be a little bit of an embarrassment on the world stage. And now they're saying that Trump is also embarrassing them, even though he's kind of committed to this World Strongman Act.
Underlying all these issues, there is one big issue where America has had a real problem, and that is over its debts and paying for its debts and its economics policies. Maybe some fears over what is going to happen around the world because of the foreign policy has meant that there is now been an increase on the amount of money America needs to spend to fund itself. And that's the big downward trend from Trump. I think the disruption, the chaos, people are learning to live with it to an extent. And frankly, Camilla, we'll need to come back after not 100 days, not 300 days, but, 3 years and see whether the huge amount of disruption that he has caused has actually led to a richer America, which relies on a stable and richer world. Well, Greg Swenson, the president of Republicans Overseas, joins us from your rather beautiful flat in Chicago. Thanks so much for joining the Daily Tea. Camilla and I have been over a lot of the details of what's happened in a pretty noisy first 100 days, let's put it like that. I think there are 3 things here that have really cut through. Tariffs, Ukraine and China, probably. I just wondered, viewing it from America, what has cut through for the American voters?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And that's what President Trump focuses on. He really does care about the American people more than he cares about diplomacy and getting along with the Davos crowd. So I think, and I sound like I'm on a campaign trail, but it's true. And so, he's looking at, what's best for the American people or the American voter. That doesn't mean that it's a zero-sum game, that it has to be at the expense of Ukraine or China or any other trading partner. But I do think that this is, a return, in many ways, a return to common sense. And common sense includes, the 50% of Americans that don't own any equities, or don't participate in the stock market. 12% of the equities are owned by 40% of the people. 88% of equities are owned by 12% of the people. So that, it's interesting that his new coalition is more of the, the working class, and, good for him for looking out for them.
But do we not think that perhaps even working class people working in Rust Belt America have not been quite worried by the tariff war, by some of the economic decisions he's made, the so-called price of eggs that Kamal and I have already discussed, and the need to bring them down and to not just make America great again, but make America wealthy again? There will be obvious concerns that some of his economic policies have just been slightly off the reservation.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think, people and markets don't love uncertainty. And when you have a change agent, he has to break some eggs, speaking of eggs. It's a moment where, there is going to be a little bit of sort of an unsettled nature. And that makes people nervous, especially when, 92% of the media commentary on President Trump is negative. So, I think there's a lot of alarmism here. And I think if you really look at, sort of the evidence, the tariff and the so-called trade war, will actually have some healthy outcomes. It's just that there might be some speed bumps along the way. And the other thing I often point to is, Trump 1.0 was just a fantastic economic outcome for Americans. The deregulation and tax reform, by the way, which we're going to see again, we're seeing it already, especially in the energy sector, really liberated the U.S. economy. Real wages went up in the Trump first term. It went up 8% over 4 years. That's 2% a year in real terms. That's inflation adjusted, versus 0.5% per year in the Obama years, very anemic. So we had 4 times the wage growth in Trump 1.0 than we had in Obama. And then, of course, with Biden, you had negative wage growth, or, wages went down in real terms for Biden's 4 years. So down 3% over 4 years. So, we're looking at, a track record, which is very positive. It's hard for a lot of voters to see that. They don't remember it in many ways. Seems like ancient history, 2019. But I do think, when they look at what he's doing with tariffs to fix what's broken in the so-called free trade, which is free and unfair trade, fix what's broken, bring some manufacturing back to that very Rust Belt you mentioned. I'm here in Chicago in the middle of it. And I do think that you look at the other legs on the stool, which is tax reform, deregulation, and energy reform. That, energy prices really drive economic growth. They drive just about, prices on just about everything, fertilizer and food. And so I think you'll see, a lot of anti-inflationary measures. And so I don't think the consumer is going to be hit. And tariffs aren't necessarily inflationary, maybe one-time price adjustments. But, India has massive tariffs. China has massive tariffs. There's a deflationary crisis in China right now. So this idea that, tariffs are only used by, mean Mr. President, and they're going to cause inflation, there's very little evidence that that's true.
Many people, Greg, would agree with a lot of the analysis about a real need for tariff reform, which Donald Trump has obviously made a key part of actually both presidencies. I suppose the issue is, for many businesses that employ, obviously, the vast majority of people, is the day-to-day volatility around what that policy actually is. So from one morning to the next, you genuinely don't know what the policy is, and businesses need to be able to plan. We've seen the effects on the equity and the debt markets. So the chaos is maybe the problem rather than the policy itself. And that has increased, nearly every economist suggests, and many very big fund managers and bank leaders, has increased the chance of recession in America.
Yeah, I think that is greatly exaggerated. I got a kick out of the economists that they found in October to say that Trump's economic policies would be much worse than Kamala Harris's economic policies. I mean, I guess it's not too hard to go to a handful of universities and find 17 economists that hate President Trump. So I'm a little bit skeptical, as you can tell, on that kind of alarmism. I do agree totally, Kamal, and you make some really good points that the volatility and the lack of clarity, it makes it hard not only for the markets. I mean, as you know, markets hate uncertainty, but it also makes it hard on decision makers, as you pointed out, and that's really true. And I think the only, the problem is, the president said this might be some tough medicine. When you have to do something that's disruptive because of what we've been left with, which is 36 trillion in debt and an economy completely dependent, not completely, but to a great degree, dependent on government. Most of the job growth the great majority of the job growth in the last 4 years was government and healthcare, which is basically government. And so, we've got some real challenges, and the trade deficits are unsustainable, and that has to be corrected. So there's all kinds of, moving parts. And I know I totally agree with you that the volatility is difficult, but unfortunately, I don't think there's any other way to do it. And you're going to see trade deals. The real outcome here is the trade deals that will come. And I think the first one is any minute now. And that's with India, which is a, massive trading partner, but also has significantly higher tariffs than most of our other trading partners. So that'll be a real benchmark. And I believe, we'll be able to model a lot of other trade agreements after the India deal, if they do in fact come first.
You mentioned free trade deal with India. Yeah. We've been talking about an imminent free trade deal with America for many, many years. Trump 1.0 and now Trump 2.0. Do you ever think we'll get there? Given that we are saying here under our Labour government that we don't seem to be willing to allow American goods in agriculture and automobiles to actually come here because we're more friendly with the EU.
Yeah, look, I think they will do a deal. I think Rachel Reeves desperately needs a win. I think that most of the regulatory stuff, is decorative. I mean, chlorinated chicken is my favorite. It's pretty obscene. They make it sound like people don't have chlorine wash in any of their foods, even though we do in the UK, with blueberries and salad and everything else. You'd have to eat 3 whole chickens for 50 years to have any excess chlorine wash in you, and also, that it might be a moment to embrace deregulation. The chlorinated chicken has roughly 2% salmonella incidence, whereas non-chlorinated washed chicken has 15 to 20. In Great Britain, it's 15 to 20% salmonella. I'd rather have chlorine than salmonella, but I love British chicken. So I think let the free market work, and if we want free and fair trade, let's make it free and fair. And I do think that there's a real opportunity for Rachel Reeves, because the Trump, as you know, likes the UK. He's very fond of the UK. There's the cultural and historical ties are meaningful. I was hoping the UK would be the first trade deal announced, but I'm sensing it's going to be India.
Greg, can we move on to foreign affairs? I mean, you're not the typical kind of MAGA. You're a well-travelled man. I know you spend a lot of time in England and you're an Anglophile. Equally, my impression of you, because you've done quite a lot of appearances on GB News and on UK media, is that, you would be very much aligned with sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite kind of politics. Yeah. And yet we have seen what strikes some as a degree of appeasement towards Russia. We've seen the Pax Americana rather put in jeopardy. And of course, that worries people across the ideological divide. Aren't you uncomfortable with some of the things he's been saying about Ukraine, describing President Zelensky as a dictator, that appalling scene that played out in the Oval Office?
Of course, I'm uncomfortable with some of the conversation, because that's the way President Trump is. He's provocative, he's unorthodox. It's something that we've gotten used to. And what we realize is this classic Trump strategy, to do something provocative. Everybody freaks out about it for 3 days or 3 months. And then it turns out he was right, or the outcomes were positive. And thanks for the compliment. First of all, Camilla, I dress like a country club Republican, but I'm not really a country club Republican. I'm much more of a conservative. And you mentioned Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, of course. And there's a lot in common, believe it or not. And maybe not in the personality traits, but there's a lot in common between President Trump and President Reagan. Remember, Reagan was polling in the 30s in 1981 and early 82. I'm sure Mrs. Thatcher here in the UK, had her challenges with voters and riots and protests. And it's sometimes difficult to be that change agent. And that's, something where, he might take a hit in approval ratings because of some of this stuff. Definitely on Ukraine and Russia, that it's been a really difficult negotiation, to say the least. The real wild card here is Putin, as we all know. And I think that, unfortunately, things got testy in the Oval Office with Zelensky, but I recall that the first 40 minutes were like incredibly diplomatic, especially by President Trump standards. He was really polite and complimentary to Zelensky for 40 minutes. It's only in the last 13 where it blew up, because I think Zelensky, was too aggressive. And look, they kissed and made up and had a really iconic moment in the Vatican over the weekend. And then I also want to just recall that, the time for deterrence, unfortunately, is before a conflict breaks out, or potential conflict. And you saw real deterrence, or peace through strength, which again is very Reaganite in the first term. He was very hostile to Putin, or aggressive, just like, Reagan saying, it's good versus evil, or the evil empire, and we win, they lose. That was considered very undiplomatic, and it really shook the salons of Europe, and especially in Brussels back in and Berlin back in, or I guess it would have been Hamburg back then. I forget what the capital was. But I do think that there's a lot of similarities. And look what Trump did in the first term. He called out Putin for killing his own people in 1999. Clinton, Bush, and Obama all knew that. They had that information from the CIA. They chose not to call him out on it. He puts, Nord Stream 2 sanctions on early on in his term. Of course, Joe Biden took them off right away when he became president in 2021. So, he sent Javelin missiles to Kyiv. He withdrew from the medium-range missile treaty. He killed, had 300 Russian mercenaries killed in Syria. So, he was not, kissing up to Putin by any means. And I think that, if you look at the peace through strength strategy, and if you look, deterrence, and as well as the economic strategy, which is tax reform, deregulation, and energy liberation, he's very Reagan-esque and very Thatcher-esque, if I can use that term.
He's found it harder, though, hasn't he, Greg, than maybe he imagined. He said there would be peace in Ukraine in 24 hours.
Yeah.
He said there'd be peace between Israel and Hamas, or more accurately, that Hamas would be defeated or there would be hell to pay. Let's look at the next 100 days, or maybe beyond that, or the rest of this year. What do you think the Ukraine-Russia peace deal, if there is to be one, will look like? Let's start there. And then will there be these other peace victories, or will he be able to blame Russia, blame Hamas, and say they could have had a deal, but they've walked away?
I don't know is the answer, the honest answer, Kamal. I mean, it's so unpredictable, especially in Ukraine, where it's, as I said, the wild card is Putin. And, there might not be an end to this thing. Maybe the stalemate continues. I think, we've known, and the Ukrainians knew back in 23 that this was a stalemate that couldn't be won. Both Mark Milley, the chair of the Joint Chiefs in the United States, Biden's chief of staff, basically said to Biden, this war is not winnable. It's a stalemate. It's time to negotiate. And Zelensky's counterpart in Ukraine said the same thing to Zelensky. And unfortunately, Zelensky fired his chief military leader. And then, of course, Joe Biden just ignored Mark Milley because he didn't fire anybody. And so, this was a moment. And unfortunately, we're still in that moment, 20 months later. And it's sad to see. I don't know what the outcome is. What I do know is that there will be unhappiness on both sides. And I think that that's just the nature of this particular war that continues to grind. Obviously, no one can trust Putin. And he seems to be using the old Soviet playbook, which is just delay and avoid and rearm. And so, ultimately that fails because the Russian economy is really in bad shape. The European economies combined are 10 times that of Russia. You've got a conventional military that's really weak. I mean, they can't even beat Ukraine. I mean, if that's saying something, but they have 4,500 nuclear warheads, and that's why Putin and Russia have a really outsized influence on geopolitics because of that. And so, I think we all have to be careful in dealing with that. I think the Middle East is easier because the Israelis have had just an incredible, I wouldn't say 2 years since, or whatever it's been since October 7th, it's been 18 months roughly. The last, 9 or 12 months have been really good for the Israelis. Syria kind of went away on its own, or the Assad regime, but they essentially defeated the Hezbollah. They've really taken it to Hamas. I think that ultimately ends up being a victory, and they defended themselves and then attacked Iran and really did some of the dirty work for the Americans in the region. So I think that ends up being a Trump, kind of a throwback to Trump 1.0, where you'll see peace in the Middle East. It might come as a defeat to Hamas. Obviously, they don't seem like they're interested in negotiating or truce and releasing hostages. So I think ultimately they're going to have to be defeated, and they very likely will be. Iran is a different story because it's very current. So I don't know what the outcome will be, but the attitude and the treatment of Iran in Trump first term was very effective. The sanctions were very effective. They were basically broke. They could not arm their militias. They couldn't arm their proxies, the Houthis, for example. And then when Biden came in, elevated energy prices globally because of his hostility to the American energy sector, and then lifted all the sanctions or didn't enforce the sanctions on Iran, put $60 billion of fresh cash into the mullah's pockets, and that basically rearmed the proxies, and look what happened. So I think we go back to sanctions and negotiating, and hopefully get to the right outcome peacefully.
Final quick question. Why are people making and wearing Trump 2028 hats when he's not supposed to be able to stand for a third term? What's going on here, Greg?
It's just it's Steve Bannon having fun with the media. It is completely obscene, and it's pretty funny, but people take it too seriously, and we shouldn't.
Greg Swenson, thank you very much indeed for joining us from what looks like quite sunny Chicago. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg. What I love about people like Greg is that they come here and they are assured about what is happening. Because I think he's right that it can feel in the media, if he's right in America, 92% of the media is sort of against Donald Trump, that everything is chaos. But it's good to hear that the supporters of Donald Trump are still assured about where the 47th president is going, and that he will get to a position where America will be more wealthy and more secure.